about 18 months of age, I want to tell you about a person who started reading the newspaper. 18 months. Casey, at 18 months, were you reading the paper? I wasn't either, all right. At 3 years old, his father taught him the Greek alphabet, and he started reading Homer in the Greek. He would later teach himself to read Latin. At 6 years old, he spoke 7 languages fluently. At 8 years old, he passed the entrance exam for MIT. At 9 years old, he passed the same college entrance exam, but for Harvard this time. They wouldn't let him in at 9 years old. He had to wait 2 more years until he was 11, until he was finally able to enroll there. He graduated Harvard at the age of 16. His IQ ranged from about 250 to 300. This is a real person. Einstein's IQ was probably 200-ish, something like that, not even close. You guys know who I'm talking about? His name is William Sidis. He's probably best known as the smartest man who has ever lived. Died in 1944 at the age of 46 as a cleric in a menial business office, basically forgotten, an eccentric, and a recluse. William Sidis started out his life really, really well. He ended his life very poorly, very poorly. This morning is our last series, our last sermon that we're going through in our series on 2 Timothy. And at the end of his life, the Apostle Paul said something incredible. As he saw his death imminently approaching, he gave us these 3 statements. He says, in the past perfect tense, I have fought the good fight. That's something that took place in the past. It was completed action with present tense results. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Last week, we looked at the phrase, I have fought the good fight. And what does it mean to fight in the Christian life? Today, I want to look at this phrase, I have finished the race. I'm going to tell you just a really quick story because I did run track 1 year of my life, Brad. I was a 7th grader. I was Greendale Middle School. My 2 events in track were the 200 and the 400. Any of you guys, track runners out there? Where's the Rice girls? I don't know if I saw Jeremy and Katie this morning. Yeah, there they are, right in the back. We got some. Kaylin, what's your event? 800. Okay. I couldn't pace myself for the 800. There's too many laps for me. So I was a sprinter, but I wasn't like the fastest sprinter. So I couldn't do like the 100-meter dash. I had to do the 200. I could sprint the entire 200. I was okay at it. The event that I really just was terrible for me was the 400. And the 400 is just one full lap around the track. The best guys, girls that run it can sprint the whole way through and really never slow down. So I'll never forget my first run at a track meet running the 400. And here's what I did. I've heard about Olympic runners, college runners. Certainly I'm not too far off from them. And they could sprint the whole way. So I'm going to sprint the whole way on the 400. I take off out of the starter blocks, gun goes off, and I go as fast as I can, as hard as I can, as the race begins. A quarter way into the race, I'm in the lead by a big amount. Halfway into the race, I'm still in the lead, but by a much smaller amount. 3/4 around the track, I'm beginning to lose the lead a little bit. And so what happens is you go into the final straightaway around the track, and runners have this this thing that'll happen. It's like, you don't want to say it. It's like saying the word shank in golf. You don't want to say it. You don't want to think about it. For a runner, it's hitting the wall, okay? And if a runner hits the wall, here's what happens. All of their energy is just gone. Everything that they had that they need to finish the race is just been depleted. So I come in my first race, run the 400 on the last final stretch, and I'm leading almost the whole way, and I just see this guy, boom, flies past me, boom, flies past me, and I'm like, where are all these guys coming from? Huffing and puffing as fast as I can. I hit the wall. After that, I traded to golf. So I was done with track. Only reason I did track was to prepare for football anyway. So anybody that can run around a circle, Kaylin, and enjoy that, hey, more power to you. I appreciate you. not for me. Paul uses a metaphor of running a race in 2 Timothy, and he does so for a reason. Paul, much like myself, he didn't start the race really well. Paul started his race after God as a Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He thought he was doing the right things and living his life in the right way, but he came to find out that he was drastically wrong in those things. In the middle of his life, he experienced a dramatic and traumatic conversion on his road to Damascus. Here in 2 Timothy, we see the Apostle Paul crossing the finish line, coming to that final stretch in his earthly life as he has run this race for the Lord and for Jesus. It was the Greek and the Romans who brought athletic games to the culture, to the Jewish culture, really in the first century and before that. Antiochus Epiphanes was the first to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. The metaphors that Paul uses in 2 Timothy would have been very well known to his first century listeners. Herod the Great built a theater and an amphitheater, a stadium and a hippodrome in Caesarea Maritima. This is one of the stops that you'll go to if you ever have a chance to visit the Holy Land in Israel. You can see this was actually in Herod the Great's amphitheater here, the Colosseum kind of feel to it. This is where they would have the chariot races, and they always talk about the narrow turn around that track. When the chariots hit that turn, all of them are going to go flying, and it's going to get really, really fun around that time. The games were held every 5th year in Jerusalem by Herod the Great. Harold the Great is out in the foyer somewhere. So there he is. Sorry, man. I got Harold on the mind up here. I don't know. The earliest competitions in the first century it was running and it was wrestling. So you're going to see this image in artifacts in the first century when seeing things like the Colosseum and like these sporting events that were happening. When Paul says that he has fought the good fight, he's referring to wrestling in the games. He's referring maybe even to boxing. When he says, I have finished the race, of course, he's referring to running. And every indication we have from this text is not that Paul started his race really well, but everything is about finishing the race. He's come to the end of the race. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to just talk about finishing our race after the Lord Jesus, finishing the race that God has given us to run in the Christian life. We're going to look at two things in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. Number one, in order to finish the race well, we need to endure faithfully. Number two, we need to finish expectantly. Number one, endure faithfully. Number two, finish expectantly. Leland Ryken says this. He says, not everyone dies well, but only those who are strong in faith, bold in courage, and well prepared to meet their God. Puritan Edmund Barker has put it this way: every Christian has two great works to do in the world: to live well and to die well. Let's talk about finishing the race. Let's talk about dying well this morning at TBC. Number one, how do we die well as Christians? We faithfully endure. The Apostle Paul and God calls us to endure faithfully. Over and over again, we've read this command to endurance in 2 Timothy. You've seen it several times now. In chapter 2, verse 12, Paul said, if we endure, we will also reign with him. In chapter 2, verse 24, he calls us to patiently endure evil, not just bad things that might happen to you, not just difficult circumstances, but patiently endure even evil things against you. In chapter 4, verse 5, he said to always be sober-minded, endure suffering. The Greek word for endurance, we've talked about it several times here at TBC. It's hupomeno. Meno is to remain or to abide. It's the word that you see in John 15, abiding in Christ. Hupo is the added prefix to it. It means to remain under, live under, maybe even stay under. The Greek lexicon defines this word endurance as this: to stay in a place beyond an expected point of time. An alternative definition means to maintain a course of action in the face of undesired opposition. To endure is to stay in a place beyond an expected point of time or maintain a course of action in the face of opposition. You've seen this word earlier in some of the other one of Paul's writings, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7, the love chapter. In the Bible, one of the characteristics of love is that love endures all things. James 5:11 talks about the endurance of Job. But more than any other motivation or person in the New Testament, the model for faithful endurance is always and always comes back to the person of Jesus Christ. Hebrews 12 commands us to run the race with endurance, looking to Jesus, who has done what? He has endured the cross for us and for our salvation. And here's the really hard truth about this. Enduring faithfully and finishing the race of our earthly lives means sometimes God asks us to stay exactly where we are, even in difficult situations. Enduring faithfully and finishing the race of our Christian lives means sometimes God asks us to remain exactly where we are, even in times of difficulty and suffering. When facing suffering, we often want to medicate, eliminate, or eradicate, when God really wants us to stay with him, pray with him, and trust in him along the journey, no matter how hard it gets. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10, Paul said that he himself endures all things, present tense. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, despite persecutions and suffering, Paul endured, past tense, as he sees the end of his life approaching. In chapter 4, verse 3, a time is coming when people will not endure. Timothy was to be different. Timothy was called to faithful endurance. A friend of mine told me this. He said that there's been a lot of studies done on Navy SEALs. It revealed that in SEAL training, when candidates in SEAL training think that they have just exhausted all resources, that they're about to give up and just bow out of training altogether, when candidates get to that point in their mind, here's what they say. They say the Navy SEAL has reached 40% of his entire potential. In Navy SEAL training, when you think you've given everything you got, you're gonna go to the bell and just tap out. You literally still have 60% left in your system to give. It's a lot of mind over matter type of stuff. Many of you in this room likely feel that you have hit max capacity. Many of you in this room are worn out. You have fought and ran hard, especially at the beginning. And now you're getting closer and closer to the end. What Paul was encouraging Timothy to do was to think about the end of the race, getting to that finish line and then crossing it over successfully. J.I. Packer says this, in today's world, death is the great unmentionable, just as sex was about 100 years ago. To invite discussion of it, even in the church, is felt to be of bad form. And we don't like talking about death. Welcome to TBC. We're gonna talk about dying well today. You guys probably woke up on daylight savings thinking, man, I came an hour early out of my life for this. Listen, it wasn't always that way. In the church and really in history, medieval Christians and mostly Puritans thought much about the art of dying well. They preached on it, they wrote on it, they talked about it in sermons and Bible studies. They came back to the text over and over again. Since death really is the one certain fact in life, then Christians should face it and handle it effectively, righteously, and godly in the present age to get us into that future kingdom, that future eternity to come. Charles Spurgeon put it this way. He said, "We are flying as on some mighty eagle's wing, swiftly on towards eternity. Let us then talk about preparing to die." One man has put it this way. He says, in every century until our own, Christians saw life as preparation for eternity. In every century until our own, in the history of the Christian church, Christians saw life as preparation for eternity. I want you to think often about the reality of death. The Bible will say to you it's actually more valuable for you to go to a funeral than it is for you to go to a party, because that's the end of every person, and the living take those things to heart. In fact, I would encourage you, in the back of my Bible, I keep an obituary of, typically it's the last funeral that I've done or taken part of here at TBC. I keep one, a laminated copy of my dad's obituary in my Bible, just as a reminder that this is a guy that died way too early, right? And if he could do it all over again, he would have lived his life a lot differently. There's no question about it. The other one I just happen to have in here today is Martha Zachary Roy. I love this one statement that it says about her. It says, her relationship and walk with the Lord were the cornerstone of Martha's world. Her relationship and walk with the Lord Jesus Christ was the cornerstone of her world. That's who she was. Have you taken time to think about the race? Have you taken time to stop and consider the end of your race? Benjamin Franklin said this: if you don't want to soon be forgotten when you are dead and rotten, either write the things worth reading or do the things worth writing. It's important how we live in light of eternity. How will you finish the race? What legacy are you going to leave to your family members, to those who are closest to you, and people that you have an influence over? Number one, as Paul was finishing his race, he called Timothy to endure and to endure faithfully. Number two, finish expectantly. Number two, finish expectantly. After Paul gave these three statements that are so memorable in verse 7, he continued on in verse 8, and it goes something like this. Look down at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. He says, henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me also, but also, to all those who have loved his appearing. And not only to me, but also to all of those who have loved his appearing. The early Greeks were the first to see the need for sporting officials. In fact, they held a special place in the first century and a key role in the games. They were referred to as a special title. If you were a referee of the games or an official of the games, you were called an agonithetai. Agonithetai. Okay, thetai is the word for organizing. Agony is the word for just the struggle, the fight. The officials in the race, the judges of the competition, they were the organizers of agony. They were the organizers of the struggle. And they made sure that everything took place according to the standards, the rules of the game. For 10 months preceding the games, they lived in special housing that was provided for them by the government. They learned the rules of the game. They learned how to be a judge and how to be a good one at that. They were especially known for their fairness and for their inability to be bribed in any way. In fact, they usually got the judges from a specific city in Greece, where all of the judges were available and ready, and it was passed down from one generation to the other. One of their responsibilities was to award the victor, and often the victor would get a laurel wreath on their head if they won first place in the competition. Paul picked up on that cultural practice. In verse 8, you see it? Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. This could mean a crown of righteousness, like we read about in the ESV. It could also mean a crown which is righteousness. All right, your translations will depend on one of those readings. Usually the former is preferred to the latter. One of 5 passages in the New Testament talk about crowns. Some crowns in the New Testament are given as just as an indicator of everlasting life. The second you place your faith in Jesus Christ, you are given a crown in the Bible in eternity. Other crowns are given for rewards in the Bible for living this life faithfully. What I want you to pay special attention to is the marked difference between 2 things in this text. There is a distinct difference between finishing the race and receiving the reward. Finishing the race and receiving the reward. While the finish line was right in front of Paul, Judgment Day was not. Judgment Day was a day that he was going to look forward to yet in the future. In fact, in some of your translations, the day there, the D is capitalized, referring to the specific time of God's judgment day for all people and for all history. Unlike the games where one victor is crowned immediately, Paul was thinking about a future reward for several people, not only him, but for all of those who have loved the Lord's appearing. Listen, up to this point in verses 6-8, and everything has been the Apostle Paul speaking in the first person. I am already being poured out. My departure has come. I have fought. I have finished. I have kept. There's a shift at the end of verse 8. And it goes from that first person singular now to a you, to a different referent. Paul made it explicit what was implicit in the previous verses. What awaited Paul was the motivation that awaited for Timothy as well. What awaits all of those who have longed for Christ. 2 Timothy ends with a strong note of eschatology. Paul was expectant. He was looking for and he was confident in the perfect judge who would measure his life against the standard of Jesus Christ, who would usher in a perfect judgment day for all people. He was looking forward to Christ's return. He was looking forward to the judgment of Christ. There's a marked contrast between those who wait expectantly and those who wait fearfully. Look at verse 10 of your text. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Verse 8, there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, for me on that day, not only to me, but also those who have loved his, Christ's appearing. Paul wanted Timothy to long for or love the thought of Christ's return. Not like Timothy, who loved and longed for the thought of the world and finding enjoyment and gratification in the world instead. Listen, how can we prepare well for eternity? One thing I want to think about and talk about, I happen to know that there are several people in this room who are retirement age. I know there are several more people that are a little above retirement age, Roy, sitting over there. How do you begin to talk to Kaylin, who's running track up there, about preparing for death, and Roy over here, who's a little bit closer to it, right? The Bible talks about eternity. It talks about preparing for it. And so I want to give you a few things to think about, all of us, no matter where you are at in life. Number one, live every day in preparation for your last day. The Bible will tell you to live every single day of your life in preparation for the last earthly day of your life. Most of the Psalms in the Bible were written by David, Solomon. You've got a couple other groups of writers. Psalm 90 is an interesting psalm. It's the only psalm that's attributed to Moses in the Psalter. And if you remember, Moses led the Israelites for 40 years in the wilderness, but God did not allow him to cross over the Jordan River and come into the possession of the land with the people of Israel. Moses would be back overlooking the Israelites as they crossed over. He wouldn't live to see the day that they crossed the Jordan River. Psalm 90 might have been a final prayer of Moses at the end of his life. In Psalm 90, verse 12, he said this. He wrote, "Teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom." Teach us to number our days that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Perhaps one of the most encouraging aspects of this verse is that verb teach, the command to teach us. Living our days purposefully, wisely, with the right perspective is not the natural thing to do. We have to be taught to number our days. We have to be taught to think about eternity, even when we're living today on a day-to-day basis. Something has to be learned over time, that we are finite. God is God and we are not, and every single day is a gift from him. We don't deserve, nor are we entitled to the next day. Any day could be our last, and so we number our days. One person put it this way, he said, dying well means living more fully. Living well means dying more readily. Dying well means living more fully in this life. Living well means dying more readily. When we number our days, we realize that there's going to be a lot of things in our hearts and in our lives that need to die 1,000 deaths. A lot of sin needs to die in our hearts. A lot of thoughts, a lot of selfish, self-centered motivations need to come to an end. For a Christian, we are constantly giving ourselves over to death, death to sin, death to self, death to our self-centered desires, in order that we might live for God. When those things die, they make room in our heart for this new redeemed life for Christ to shine through it. Death for the Christian is not something that happens at the end of our life. It's something that happens in the middle of our life, or maybe even the beginning of our life. Over and over again, as we learn to kill sin, unless sin kills us, we die to self over and over again. C.S. Lewis says this, he says, if you read history, you will find that the Christians who did the most for the present world are precisely those who thought the most about the next. Colossians 3:2 says this, set your mind on the things above, not on the things which are on this earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. The proper stance for the Christian is a stance of death to life, to new life in Christ because of what he has done for us. Live every day in preparation for your last day. Number 2, resolve to endure hardship. Resolve to endure hardship. No matter what it is, no matter when you face it, no matter how tough it might be. You've probably heard this. There are 2 types of people in the world. Those who are currently going through a trial and those who just got out of one. Right. In a fallen world, you will experience hardship. Hardship, trials, and suffering are ubiquitous in the Christian life. It is the normal way that we walk in a fallen world. I had a friend in Kansas who used to say, getting old is the hardest part of life. Therefore, God saved it for last. Those of you guys who have walked alongside of loved ones and experienced heartache, you know exactly. Prepare your heart and mind for future hardship. Dying isn't easy. Don't expect it to be easy. We have a way in our culture of hiding death, of running from it. Go experience it in a nursing home sometime. Watch what happens. It's not easy. I want you to think about a few questions. As you get older, do you find yourself getting bitter or getting better? As you get older in life, ask yourself at least a few questions here. Number 1, do you find yourself getting more bitter or do you find yourself getting better? Number 2, do you have friends who long for the appearance of Jesus or who loathe the appearance of Jesus? Are you surrounding yourself with friends who long for the appearance of Jesus or who might loathe the thought of a judgment day and one God who will bring everybody to it? Number 3, do you find yourself more in love with the world or more in love with the Word? As you approach closer and closer to the other side of glory, do you find yourself more in love with the world or more in love with the Word? And you can have the world and everything in it. Number 3, before you leave, think about what you leave. Before you leave this earth, think about what you're going to leave. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, for a believer, death has lost its sting. We have no fear in death. Jesus both overcame death and rendered it powerless. Nevertheless, death remains. It's an enemy of God, and it won't be finally annihilated until Christ returns and sets up his perfect kingdom. Since we all know we will one day die, it's important to think about your legacy. What are you going to leave to people when you leave this earth? How are people ultimately going to remember you, their interactions with you, their relationship with you? Be good stewards of your resources. You can't take them with you when you go. I love what Randy Alcorn said. Do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going. Prepare for your funeral. There's going to be costs associated with it. Your family is going to appreciate those things. You can't avoid the day of your death. You can't work around it. It is inevitable, and it's a glorious thing for those who prepare well. Proverbs 13, verse 22 says, "A wise man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." Steward your finances well. Steward your finances well. What spiritual assets are you passing down to the next generation? An inheritance is something that you give. A legacy is something that you leave. An inheritance is something that you give. A legacy is something that you leave. And sometimes those two things are mutually exclusive. Here's Paul's legacy, Timothy. What legacy are you leaving in your life? Who's the legacy that you're leaving in your life? Who are you investing in who knows you maybe even better than you know yourself? That they might carry on the things that are important to you in life and ministry. Who are you modeling your marriage to? Who are you teaching the fundamentals of the faith to? Who are you sharing the gospel with on a normal basis? Who are you encouraging every chance you get to keep going strong, to keep walking after the Lord, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how difficult it might be, to stay faithful, to faithfully endure? Who's your Timothy? Paul's legacy was Timothy. Who's yours? Let's pray.